When I was a kid, I believed I was creative. I knew I was creative. I used to love singing, dancing, painting, kind of all those creative endeavors. I had the imagination that was crazy, and I knew that I was creative until one day in the first grade, in art class. The assignment that day was to do a beautiful watercolor painting of a field of flowers. And I was excited because I knew that I could just pour my heart out onto that paper. So there I was, a little kid, feet dangling from the seat, and I grabbed my paintbrush and I went from the water to the pigment to the paper, just like pouring my heart out onto the sheet of paper. This was going to be my masterpiece. And the end of the hour was coming up, and our art teacher, Miss Eastman, was coming around, and she was going to look at my paper. And I was excited because, I was kind of always a teacher's pet. I always knew that I was going to get the smiling nod, the wink, the gold star on the paper. And I was excited for Miss Eastman to see my beautiful painting. So she comes up to me, she approaches me, and she grabs my paper. She looks at me, and I'm kind of eagerly looking up. And she looks down at me, looks at the paper, and says, "What are these?" I'm like, "Well, they're flowers." That's what the assignment was. She's like, "Yeah, but why are they green?" I'm like, "Well, I thought green flowers would be really pretty. I like the idea." And she looked at me, she looked at my paper, and she said, "There's no such thing as green flowers," puts it down on the table and walks away. And you can imagine in that moment, I was crushed. In that very moment, I realized I'm not creative. I thought I was creative. I thought that I loved all that stuff. I thought I was good at it, but Miss Eastman that day told me I wasn't creative. And that kind of feeling, that identity of myself, it carried into later on in my life. Even actually out of college, I was working at a church as a creative director, but I didn't think I was creative. I would just excuse it away. I was like, well, I'm good at recognizing patterns, or I'm good at math, or I'm good at seeing what others do and improving on it. Or, I would do anything to excuse away the idea that I was creative because Miss Eastman told me I wasn't creative. And it wasn't until I was getting ready to get married that I kind of started questioning that. We were in a flower store, in a floral shop, and we were walking through the aisles, and what did I see? I saw green flowers. You can't imagine what was happening in my heart at that moment. I actually called the florist over, and I was eager. I was like, "Hey, what are these?" And she's like, "Well, they're limelights." I'm like, "Yeah, whatever. But are they naturally green, or did you dye them this way?" And she's like, "Yeah, that's their natural color. They're a green flower." And you can't imagine the vindication I felt in that moment. I actually grabbed my phone, snapped a picture of it, and posted on social media, "Your class was filled with lies, Miss Eastman," and I sent it off. And man, I just felt vindicated. And I realized at that moment that lady, what she had told me in first grade, had changed a lot of what I believed about myself. She set the course for a lot of my life. And I realized, maybe if she was wrong about green flowers, maybe she was wrong about other things too. Maybe I was more creative than I thought. I wonder, who told you in your life that you aren't creative? Maybe it was a sibling who saw something you drew and they laughed about it. Or maybe it was parents who said, "Yeah, maybe don't go to art school, stick with math." Or maybe it was a teacher who just didn't believe in you or said something to you like they said to me. I believe a lot of us, even if we're working in creative areas of the church, I believe a lot of us kind of have this internal voice that tells us we aren't creative. At some point in our life, there was a switch, a creativity switch that was flipped off. And we started thinking, maybe we're not creative. So we kind of stopped trying. And I do believe creativity is sort of a switch where we can, maybe it gets turned off for us at one point in life, but I believe you can actually switch it back on. I believe you can decide, okay, I am creative, and you can actually tap into that creativity even though you maybe haven't been for a few years. The problem is I think a lot of us have a misconception of what creativity is all about. I think a lot of us relegate creativity to the arts, maybe to painting or to dancing or singing or the culinary arts. We think that's what creativity is. And yes, arts are creative endeavors, but that's not all that creativity is. I believe creativity is actually a form of problem solving. I believe it's finding a solution that no one else sees to a problem that you're presented with. So I think if we change the definition of creativity, we can actually start seeing that maybe you have the opportunity for creativity at your church or in your life or in other places that maybe you wouldn't normally think about creativity being accessible for. So the definition I want to work with today is that creativity is finding the third option when it appears there are only two. It's finding that hidden option that no one else sees. When everyone sees the obvious two options, you're able to find the hidden third option. And if you think about that, that actually can apply to many areas. Think about a church who's trying to figure out how to have enough parking in their limited parking lot. Or maybe figuring out how to make the bathroom smell good throughout the entire service, even though you know that one guy in your congregation loves to go in and destroy it between services. Or maybe a parent trying to figure out how to teach their child about God in a very anti-God world. You know, each one of those situations requires creativity, but it has nothing to do with painting. It has to do with finding that hidden solution, that hidden option, the third option to the problem. You know, actually in the scriptures, I see a perfect story that shows this kind of hidden option idea. It's the story of Gideon. In the story, Gideon was called to fight a battle. There was this massive 135,000 people army that was invaded Israel. They'd invaded Israel and they were sitting there making life difficult for the Israelites. And Gideon feels called to fight a battle. So he musters everyone he can, all the warriors in Israel that he can to fight this battle. And he gets about 32,000 people. Now you see those numbers, 32,000 people versus 135,000 Midianites. They're outnumbered like 5-1. That's a bad situation. And then if that's not bad enough, God decides to start messing with Gideon. He says, you know, Gideon, you have too many people. I want you to send some of them home. How about everyone who's afraid, go ahead and send them home. And I imagine Gideon at that moment kind of thought, okay, maybe 50 people might go home or 100, but no, 22,000 people go home. 22,000 of Gideon's 32,000 go home. He's left with 10,000 against 135,000. That's bad. Then Gideon's messed with a little bit more. God says, no, you still have too many people. I want you to take them down to the stream, and everyone who doesn't drink a certain way, I want you to send them home. So after this, Gideon's left with 300 people against 135,000. Those are impossible odds. But if you notice, there was kind of this creative solution that Gideon came up with. It doesn't actually say, the Bible doesn't say that God came up with the solution. God just told Gideon to get rid of people. Gideon actually came up with the solution. And yes, God prepared the hearts of the Midianites for the solution, but what Gideon did is in the middle of the night, he surrounded the Midianite army with trumpets and with torches. And basically what he did was a big bluff. He revealed all the torches, blew all the trumpets at the same time, and he scared the Midianites where they started turning on each other and running away. And through that creative bluff, that creative solution, 300 people beat 135,000 people. That was a creative solution. And I don't know that Gideon would have found that if it wasn't for that limitation or for that extreme problem that he was dealing with. He found this third option, this hidden third option. And I believe that's what's available to us when we're willing to look for that third option, when we're willing to look for that hidden option. The problem is we're trained to think in terms of two options. Biologists or psychologists kind of call this fight or flight response. Think about it. It's what, when you're faced with a predator, when you're faced with someone trying to kill you, you kind of revert to one of these two options. You either go fight, which is, you put up your hands and you fight your way out of it, or you run away. And that's a great survival mechanism because, whenever someone tries to attack me, I don't necessarily have time in that split second to analyze, 50 different variables and kind of juggle all these, weigh the options. No, I got to get out of there or I got to fight my way out. That's a good survival instinct. The problem is most of the problems we deal with in life don't come down to survival. They're actually more complex than that. But we're trained to think in those two options. Think about it. We're trained to kind of think in fight or flight, or in mysticism, you have the yin and the yang, the two options, yin, yang, the darkness, the light, the good, the evil. We think of kind of left or right, up or down. I kind of see this as like two-dimensional thinking, Democrat, Republican. It's these two options that we're kind of trained to think in. And I think of another thing that thinks in two options. I think of a computer. The computer that you're using right now to watch this session, everything that's going through it is ones and zeros. The video, it's a sequence of ones and zeros that the computer is interpreting to figure out what it should display. So off, on, off, on, off, on. It's thinking kind of in this binary system. And that's great for a computer. It's great for the computer to be able to analyze the information. The problem is you and I, we are not machines. You are not a machine. fact, the scriptures say that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. You don't have to relegate yourself to just two options. There's more available to you. God has given you a way to think higher than just those two options. You know that the scriptures actually say that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We're actually made in three parts. We have our body, which is kind of our flesh, blood, and bones. And then we have our soul, which is kind of our will, our intellect, our emotions. But then there's this third part of us, which is the spirit. And the scriptures say actually, before we accept Christ, before we accept the finished work of Christ, our spirits are dead. That third part of us is not alive. But then whenever we accept the Holy Spirit, he comes in and he breathes life into that spirit. And now that third part of us has life again. You know, salvation was actually sort of a third option. If you think about it, what was the Old Testament? The Old Testament was we either obey the law and we get to live, or we disobey the law and we have to die. These two options, obey the law, one option, option one, which none of us could do, unfortunately, or we disobey the law and we die. And then Jesus comes along, and it's no longer about either one of those options. His righteousness is given to us. So we no longer have to worry about obeying the law. The law has been fulfilled. We no longer have to worry about dying. It's that creative third option that none of us could have seen before. But Jesus brought that third option into the world. You know, I see the scriptures filled with these kind of third option type stories. Think about the woman who was caught in adultery in John 8. The religious leaders decide to trap Jesus. So they parade this woman who was caught in adultery in front of this crowd that Jesus was talking to. And they say, Jesus, this woman was caught in adultery. What should we do with her? You know the law. It's to stone her. What should we do? And this was a trap because Jesus' message had been one about compassion, about mercy, about turning the other cheek. And then the religious leaders were saying, okay, so let's see what he does. If he goes with that, yeah, let's go ahead and let her go. Let's just, let's forgive her. That was disobeying the law of God, and that was not a good idea. Or if he said, yeah, the law is to stone her, we got to stone her, then that all of a sudden made him seem unmerciful, and that kind of went and flew in the face of what he was teaching. So it was this trap, and I imagine if I was in that situation, if I was standing on the outside, I probably would have been like, oh boy, what is Jesus going to do? You see the trap, you see what's happening here. And Jesus kind of, he squats down in the dirt and he starts drawing in the dirt. I almost see that as kind of like a stalling tactic while Jesus was maybe listening to God or maybe just thinking. And I love the creative third response that he gives. He says, yes, the law is to stone her, but why don't you who's without sin cast the first stone? I love that. The religious leaders couldn't see that coming from a mile away. They could not see that coming. It was totally outside of their two-option paradigm. Yet Jesus presented that third option. And the crazy thing is, that provided hope for Jesus because he was in the trap. It provided hope for the crowd because they were trying to figure out, okay, is there a way out of this? What's he going to do? But it also provided hope for that woman. She knew what she'd done wrong. She knew the consequences of her sin. But through Jesus' third option, his creative third option, there was hope provided for her for the first time. Really, I see that's our job as Christians. Our job is to be that third option, to provide that third option for the world. What is our job? I believe there's this kind of creative job that's laid out for us in the book in Matthew, in 5:13 through 14. The Message paraphrase puts it so beautifully. It says, let me tell you why you're here. You're here to be salt seasoning that brings out the God flavors of the earth. If you lose your saltiness, how will people taste godliness? Love that saltiness, the taste, the flavor, the creativity, the culinary flavor. I love that. It's so creative. You've lost your usefulness and will end up in the garbage. Here's another way to put it. You're here to be light, bringing out the God colors in the world. I love that. God colors. You're bringing out the God colors. Again, so often we're tempted to think in black and white. And yes, obviously sin is black and white. There is sin, there is wrong, there is right. But so much of what we encounter in the world is not necessarily about morality. It's about problems that don't necessarily have a moral solution. It's just neither option looks good. And so often we just see kind of black and white, and we miss out on seeing the God colors of the earth because we stop looking for that third option, for that creative option. When we approach everything as black and white, we miss out on seeing the colors God created. I believe creativity for a believer can be about so much more than just art. I believe it can be about faith that God can come through. It can be about hope that there's more than what we see. And it can be about love enough to go the extra mile. God's creativity starts when things look hopeless. Whenever things make sense, whenever things are going well, there's no need for God's creativity because it's just laid out in front of us. But when things are looking dark, when things are looking bad, when things are looking hopeless, that's when God's creativity can shine through in on the situation. And that's the opportunity we have. I believe Christians should be the most creative people out there. I know we say that a lot in conferences and stuff, and it's a nice saying, but I really believe it because here's the thing. The very Creator God is living on the inside of us. The Creator himself is occupying that third part of our bodies. So why shouldn't we be the most creative? Yes, unbelievers are massively creative. We see that in film, we see that in commercials, TV, books, we see that. But how much more should believers be creative because we have that third option? Really, creativity, I see it as another form of wisdom. What's wisdom? Wisdom is seeing from a different perspective, seeing from a higher perspective. And that's what we're saying creativity is. It's seeing a third option when it looks like there's only two. It's seeing that different perspective. And the scriptures say, if anyone lacks wisdom, we can ask God who gives it to us liberally. So we can actually ask God for creativity. We can ask him for that creative solution, and he'll give that to us. I experienced that as a worship leader. I had a phenomenal band. They were kind of all under 20 for some reason, and I wasn't much older than them, and they were amazing musicians. I had this one guitar player, he was 18 years old, and he was just a phenom. He would shred on his guitar. Then I had this other guitar player, he was 15, and he was all right. But he started kind of getting this attitude. He was sort of becoming this punk where I would ask him to change something. I'm like, hey man, do you think you could change up that guitar line? It doesn't sound good. And he would look at me and just kind of, whatever. Just kind of do a hair flip. It's just this teenage punk. Frustrating me so much, it ticked me off. And it started happening week after week. It became so intense that I realized I had to do something about this. So kind of my options were, I could either kind of let it go, just kind of keep ignoring it. And that was a bad option because that was going to be a drain on the band. It's probably not good for the kid. I was probably going to lose my salvation over that. Or the other option was to confront it, yell at the kid, kick him off the band, just be like, you're an idiot, you're not even that good anyways, kick him off the band and be done with him. And I didn't like that option either because I needed a guitar player. So I didn't know what to do. And I actually, for some reason, I was wise enough to pray. And I said, God, what should I do in this situation? And it's not like I heard an audible voice from God, but I just kind of got this idea in my head that maybe I should start encouraging the kid. That was kind of counterintuitive to what I'd been doing. I'd been kind of taking it upon myself to humble him. I would tell him, you're not even that good in the first place. Why are you having this attitude? And I would just try to work to humble him, but I got the idea to encourage him instead. And so that's what I started doing. When he would show up to practice early, I would say, man, thank you so much for showing up to practice early. When he was on time, thank you for showing up on time. Obviously, you practiced during the week. Thank you so much for doing that. Man, that guitar lick sounds really good. And I started investing encouragement, investing life into this kid. And in the next few weeks, I actually started seeing a change in his attitude. He actually became eager to do what I wanted him to do. He would actually ask me, hey, is what I'm playing okay? Should I change it? Can I do anything differently? Like he actually began respecting my authority, and I began respecting him as a guitar player more. He actually became one of my most valuable musicians on the band. I started entrusting him, learning how to use Reason and Ableton and creating backing tracks for our band, and he just became this phenomenal asset to the team. And I don't know that would have happened if I would have gone with those two obvious options that were presented to me. I think it was in that third option that I was able to open up this way to work with this kid. And the coolest thing is I visited him in Nashville recently. He's living in Nashville, making a living as a musician, touring with bands. I got to see him come through my town and play with this well-known band, and he's doing phenomenally. And I actually had a part in that. Because I was willing to look for that third option, I believe that changed his situation. It changed his life. It changed his ability to see himself. And that third option was actually something that was not just for me, because yes, it helped the band, but it actually helped the kid and changed the situation for him. And that's the opportunity we have with creativity. The thing is that required more work on my part. It required a conscious suppression of my emotions. And I had to say, okay, I know how I feel, but I'm going to choose to be encouraging to this kid. But isn't that what Jesus calls us to? Isn't that what he calls us to? That going the extra mile, finding that extra thing that appears kind of beyond what our obvious first two options are? That third option, it requires more work, but it's the right thing. So how do you find the third option? You know, it's all well and good what I've been saying, but how do you actually find the third option in your life or in your church? You know, the first step is you have to start by rejecting the obvious options. You know, so often we can see these options as like menu items on your menu. Have you ever had a difficult time trying to decide what you want to order on a menu? Maybe you have 2 or 3 options that seem good to you, and you just kind of, until the waiter comes, you just mull those over in your mind. Oh man, I like the side on this item. I like the entree on this. I like the description on this. And all you're doing is just thinking about those 2 or 3 options, and you can't see anything else because you have tunnel vision. And that's what happens so often whenever we only look at our first 2 obvious bad options, is we kind of start wanting to mix and match, and it's not going to work. So we have to, first of all, start by just rejecting those, clear those off the table. Then next, we have to believe that there is a third option. A lot of times I think we don't look for the third option because we don't believe it's there. So we have to clear those options away and then start believing and looking for that third option. And then the third, and I know this sounds so Christian and so trite, but pray. Ask God for the third option. You know, it's sad that that's such a trite thing for us, that's such a Christian response, because really that's what the scriptures command us to do. But it's something I so often, maybe you don't do this, but I so often forget to actually ask God and consult God and pray to God about this stuff. So that's the third thing, is just pray and ask God. Then the fourth is look for God's limitations as direction. So think about Gideon. God was messing with Gideon. He was limiting Gideon by removing from 32,000 people, removing them down to 300. That was an extreme limitation. But through that limitation, Gideon was able to find the solution. Think about it. He couldn't have done that kind of shock and awe tactic if he had surrounded them with 32,000 people. 32,000 people can't sneak up on an army. They would have been found out. But those 300, it was possible to do that. Through that limitation, there was the opportunity for creativity. So maybe God has limited you in some way. Maybe he's limited your church. Maybe your pastor says, no, we're not going to do the multi-site model. Or maybe, we're not going to do what that big church does, or those other churches. Every other church is doing this thing, but we're not going to be doing it because God tells us no. And that can be so frustrating. We can try to kind of buck against those limitations so much, say, God, why are you limiting me this way? But what if you embraced it? What if you embraced those limitations and found the unique creative solution God has for you and for your church through that limitation? And then finally, the thing you do to find that third option is you just do the hard work. It requires hard work, but you can find that third option by doing the work. You have to realize there's always hope when everything's coming down. God's creativity happens when things look hopeless. I love this story in Joshua. I think it so perfectly sums up this talk. There's this story in Joshua where they're about to invade Jericho. They're about to knock the walls down by walking around the walls, 7 times. And Joshua's walking, and in the scripture in Joshua 5:13-14, this is what it says. It says, when Joshua was near the town of Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a sword in hand. Joshua went up to him and demanded, are you friend or foe? I love that. Joshua was thinking in that kind of binary option. Are you friend or are you foe? That's the only 2 options. You're either for me or you're against me. I love the reply. Neither one, he replied. I'm the commander of the Lord's army. It's almost like he's saying, no, I'm not friend or foe. I'm up here. I'm on God's side. Whose side are you on? And I think that's the thing we need to remember is we so often make it about our problem in ourselves. It's me or my problem. It's bad or good. But it's not about either of those things. It's about God. It's about this other thing. It's about this third thing. And we so often forget that, but it's not about us. It's about God. So let me ask you, what's your tendency when you're faced with troubles? Do you tend to rely on kind of that fight or flight? Do you maybe act up, like when you're caught in an argument, do you act up and lash out? Or do you kind of just repress and kind of get into your shell? What's your response to conflict in your life? Now imagine if you started trusting in God and his creativity. Imagine what you could do. I believe your church would look a little bit different. I believe your life would look a little bit different. I believe you could find problems for, that nursery worker who's just not where they need to be, or for the worship set that's just not quite working, or for the pastor who maybe needs to deliver some bad news, and you're able to either keep that bad news from happening, or you're able to at least provide some hope and some encouragement in that situation. I believe we could find a way to show love to our communities without standing on a street corner with a "Repent, the kingdom is near" sign. I believe we could actually show genuine love to our communities. Imagine if all of our churches started tapping into that third option, into that hidden creative option. Man, our churches and our lives would look like hope. People would see our churches and say, I need to get in there. I need hope. I need to be inside that environment because that's hope where I don't see hope. I believe we could be courage to the world around us. I believe businessmen would flock to our churches because they need the courage that we instill in them. We see courage and they need that. We would reach people left and right. I believe people would start asking for the reason for the hope that's inside us. And that's the opportunity we have through creativity and through finding the hidden option.